Hello. I think am I upside down or?
My grandson just called, so I have to be on mute because he's really loud at 5 years old. Hi, I'm Carrie.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
Is my video okay, or do I need to? Okay. Perfect.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hi, Nicholas.
Hello, nice to see you.
You too. How are you?
You're on a Zoom meeting?
Another thing in there.
Hi, Lalo. Sorry I'm late.
How you doing?
I'm good. How about you?
I am more than fine today.
Hi, Asher.
All right.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, JP. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone.
Lalo, do you want to wait like 1 more minute for more people to join? Okay. I can't hear you. Could anyone else hear him? No? Okay. Maybe try leaving and then coming back.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
I think we can go ahead and start. So I'm Lalo. I'm part of 350 South Florida Youth, an independent group from 350 South Florida. We're geared towards obviously youth members, so that means people of the age 25 and under. We started back in May, and thus far we've had, we were able to collaborate with IC Change, so they were our first guest speaker. We've done several different events, art events, and just general awareness and promoting climate change and whatever opportunities are available for youth specifically. Today we're joined by three awesome local panelists, JP from Sunrise Miami, Nick from ACE, and Elijah, a progressive candidate. And you guys can go ahead, just introduce yourselves, just a few minutes each, what your current work is, and I guess just a little bit of a bio, yeah.
Do you want to call on someone first?
Sure, yeah, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So hey everyone, my name's JP. As was mentioned, I work predominantly with Sunrise Movement, as well as like a local coalition of local and national climate action groups. I work down here as the hub coordinator of Sunrise Miami, as both a founder and hub coordinator, and I oversee the work of the hub in total. We work electorally, we work on civil disobedience, we work on lots of things. Other things and other groups that I work for are the Clio Institute, in which I help out with Gen Clio, which is the youth organizing sect of the group, as well as some of the education efforts behind it. And I co-host a podcast with another colleague and really good friend of mine, Gabby Rodriguez. We co-host a podcast on climate, which is youth-led, and it's called House on Fire, if you want to check it out. Some of the things that I'm doing now, I've recently taken up a national role with Sunrise Movement. As a strategist, we are analyzing not only this case scientifically climate, but the political climate of the United States and all of the ways that we can remodel and push forward for a multiracial working class movement that will solve the climate crisis. And we're planning for the next 3 to 5 years. So that's basically the bulk of what I do and what's going on, but I'm also just an 18-year-old kid who cares about people and places that I've grown up with. And I'm really happy to be here. So thank you guys for inviting me to participate.
Elijah, if you'd like to go ahead.
Sure, definitely. Elijah Manley here, pronouns, he or they pronouns. I just completed a run for Florida House of Representatives in District 94. We came up a little short in that race, a lot short actually, but we ran an incredible race in a really interesting time during this pandemic. So I had the opportunity recently to sit with my former opponent and talk about some of the issues that were important during the campaign, including climate change and a few other issues. I grew up here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm from here. And, I'm spending my time now just doing everything I was doing before I ran for office, organizing. I'll be taking some time to write a book. But outside of that, I'm working on other projects, including recruiting young people across the country to run for office, ensuring that they have the tools necessary and the advice, and they're able to do what they need to do to run successful races for office across the country. So I've been spending my time doing that. But outside of that, I'm just really excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about climate change, which is, I believe, the most defining issue in the state of Florida, specifically sea level rise, and what we can do to help this issue. So thank you guys for having me here.
Thank you. And last but not least, Nick.
Thank you, Lalo. Good evening, everybody. My name is Nicholas Lorenz. I use he, him pronouns. I'm joining as the youth organizer for ACE, which stands for the Alliance for Climate Education. We're a national nonprofit that just started operating in the state of Florida late last year in 2019. Our mission is to educate young people on the science of climate change and empower them to take action. So, you know, sort of depending on the time of year and the temperature outside, what that actually looks like in practice can differ. What I will say is that given the critical moment we find ourselves in 2020, both in terms of politics, the electorate, and in terms of the sort of the tipping point of the necessity of climate action, we are really focusing this year on being advocates for youth empowerment by registering as many first-time youth climate voters as possible. And in fact, just last week, as a coalition, ACE served as a convening partner for a coalition of incredible organizations, including CLIO, the CLIO Institute locally, called the Enough. And I'll share some info about that later. But if you want to check it out, you can visit, I'll type it in the chat here, weareenough2020.org. And so our efforts this year really to register thousands and thousands of young first-time climate voters really grows out of some learning that we did in 2018 as we pivoted away from more in-school climate instruction, where we offer, for example, an in-school assembly called Our Climate, Our Future Live. It's designed for high school students. It teaches them the impacts, the potential solutions, and the consequences of climate change. But since then, given that we can't go to schools anymore, school isn't really the same as it was just 6 months ago. We're focusing much more of our work virtually and digitally. Actually, that's how I came to meet Lalo, is he's a participant in ACE's Action Fellowship, which is leadership and sort of climate movement, like, I don't want to say boot camp, but readiness program to allow young leaders like Lalo to step into positions of consequence in the movement. And really excited to have this opportunity to come and share the space with two incredible young leaders like Elijah and JP. So thanks for having me, Lalo.
You guys, we'll go ahead and start now with the first question. I think it's only appropriate if we do mention the COVID pandemic. So we'll start off with a question relating to that. And here's a little bit of a background for it as well. So COVID-19 has highlighted the worst of our nation's differing treatment of its racial and ethnic minority groups. A lack of health equity brought about by increased poverty rates and decreased healthcare access, among other factors, has denied these communities the same resources and safety from the virus experienced by their white counterparts. How does this pandemic's unveiling of systemic inequity relate to the risk climate change poses on the same minority communities?
Are we going to go in the same order?
I guess, or
Okay.
whatever is best for you guys.
Okay. So I think it's very clear that COVID-19 has exposed the historic shortcomings of our economic model that has prevailed since the foundation of this country, which has treated people and the natural world as assets that are profitable as they are disposable. And I think that's what we're seeing very much right now when we're facing these spiraling crises of climate change and COVID-19, which should deal with systemic overarching scientific solutions that are cast away by the power grabs of powerful majorities of people and horrible theories of racial and religious supremacy. The way that these two crises intersect comes from where our government and our leaders unfortunately place their priorities. Right now, we have reached a breaking point racially as we have witnessed so many institutions literally devalue and exploit and terminate the lives of Black people and minorities at the borders. And what we really deal with right now in terms of these two crises is seeing how historical narratives of the past, when we talk about slavery and segregation, still very much take place today in much more covert ways that are just as inhumane and exploitative. And I think that furthermore, the ways that these two crises intersect are in the ways that the folks, at least in terms of climate change, the folks who have contributed to this crisis the least are the ones who are paying the most immediately and the most severely, while those that have fueled it are the ones that will profit off of it. And when we analyze coronavirus, we can say the same thing for it in terms of, you know, corporate power grabs and the mechanisms of disaster capitalism, and sort of what's up at play right now when we talk about, you know, flattening curves and creating policies that are supposed to help out regular working class Americans to face this crisis, when that's really not the case.
I think I'm up next in the queue. Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of what JP said. I do think that this crisis has really showcased and brought to light the pretty gleaming inequities in American society. What I call capitalism, economic system that really exists to make everything a commodity. And we see this gleaming right in our face every single day throughout this pandemic, especially with the healthcare system. You know, how many people lost their health insurance or their health care because it was tied to their employment. A lot of people who, you know, the Blue Cross Blue Shield just didn't come through for them in time. And it goes back to everything. It isn't just, you know, related to this global health pandemic. It goes and it ties into racism. It ties into, you know, our education system, our criminal justice system as well. And, you know, the example I give to this, you know, if we tie COVID-19 into this, most of the people dying from COVID-19 or who are facing, you know, record numbers are Black people. Most of the people who are out of work and being affected economically by the crisis we're seeing are Black people and people of color. The people who are being criminalized during this crisis are people of color. A conversation that isn't talked about a lot now. The people behind the prisons right now who are locked in jail cells where they are having record numbers of COVID-19 cases and disgusting conditions where people are being sick. People have COVID-19 behind jail cells and are not being taken care of, or people are not being let out of those prisons, are Black people and people of color. So what COVID-19 has done is it has showcased really clear in our faces that the system that we have in place right now cannot continue. It is unsustainable. And it's showing right in our face right now that it just doesn't work. So how this ties in everything, how this ties into the climate change, you can see the same thing. I've always said myself that we're not done. This isn't going to be the last global health pandemic we're going to see. As I have said repeatedly, that we will see more of these pandemics as a result of climate change, whether that's airborne or waterborne diseases due to the melting of ice glaciers or whatnot, or food quality or the quality of our soil. These are, you know, issues, new generation issues that are going to be hitting our state and our country. And the people who are going to be getting affected mostly by that are going to be working class people and people of color as well. So definitely, I certainly agree with most of what's being said, but I also think right now is the perfect opportunity, perfect time in our country to not just confront these challenges, but to really provide a new program going forward.
Well, I'm not sure there's much else to cover after JP and Elijah so eloquently put it, but yeah, I think what really stands out to me after this past 6 or 7 months of living in Miami in these pandemic conditions is just that it has shed a light on racism, on institutional racism, on systems of oppression, which, you know, people have been saying for hundreds of years are there, and largely people who look like me have been refusing to accept as fact. But I think what is so critical about something that Elijah and JP both alluded to is that it's really revealing the infrastructure of that invisible system of oppression in ways that are completely undeniable, because there is attached to it a very clear human cost. And oftentimes that sort of visceral corollary, deaths, and these, you know, persistent conditions, whether that's comorbidities that might exist for particular communities because of a lack of access to healthcare, or because they live in a food desert, or because they live in the backyard of a fossil fuel power plant. This is a moment where not only our national crisis of consciousness around America's history of racism, but as like trying to deal with that on top of the pandemic, just makes this abundantly clear that if you want to pull on one thread and say, I really want to address the housing issue in Miami, or I really want to address the disparity in income inequality in Miami, which, by the way, by some measures is on par with a country like Colombia, which has rampant income inequality. You can't address one without addressing the other. You can't parse that argument. As this panel sort of idea suggests, the theme, racial justice and climate justice are the same thing when you boil it down to the action that is going to be required on a collective effort in order to sort of push that ball forward.
Thank you. Next question will be in light of Hurricane Laura and different natural disasters that go on. So nearly 1 in 3 Black residents affected by Hurricane Katrina, a storm that hit just over 15 years ago, still haven't managed to return to the city following their displacement. The city's housing recovery program distributed funds based on the appraised value of homes as opposed to the cost of rebuilding, which steeply affected the Black community's ability to rebuild as their houses were appraised at much lower rates. In the coming years, how will minority communities be affected by new, more intense natural disasters, given their historical lack of adequate funding?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you bring up the example of Hurricane Katrina, which I've been reading more so about. And we see similar cases right now, at least with Hurricane Laura approaching, similar regions. And one of the things that we really have to keep in mind that is well documented by one of my favorite authors, Naomi Klein, is that disaster capitalism and the entrenched racial inequities that it carries are very detrimental to the minority communities affected by disasters. Essentially, what disaster capitalism is when a natural disaster or some form of disaster like COVID, like hurricanes happen, and suddenly there is like a game of corporate hungry hippo in these areas in which large real estate developers and corporate power grabs take place on these vulnerable communities. And one of the very subtle and less disaster, but sort of gradually building up to a disaster case studies that we can see on the local level is that of climate gentrification. We have had through the racially oppressive processes within our government of redlining and whitewashing, we've allocated and sort of, put all of these communities historically that are minority and under-resourced low-income communities in certain areas of Miami that happen to be high ground because that's where the industrial areas were, to provide cheap labor for corporate power grabs like the railroads, like the warehouses that are now Wynwood. That's where these communities worked. And what we're seeing now is, hey, surprise, you've got climate change. So now instead of these folks who, many of them who migrated from Haiti because they were climate refugees, are now being covertly and very implicitly in very shrewd ways evicted out of their homes so this corporate power grab can withhold the valuable land that is on high ground that these places retain. So essentially it's this sort of, ooh, like we know we moved you here because we don't like Black people and you guys are poor and we also don't like poor people, but we're actually going to have you move now to places that are disposable, as we like to think of them, so we can secure our profits in the places that we actually moved you to. And it is only going to take a hurricane. It is only going to take immense amount of flooding for this to become very transparent. And the worst thing is that this has already happened, and lots of folks in these communities are being sort of not left without a choice because they can't keep up with like new property prices that they can't afford anymore and are having to move without a choice. We have this sort of idea, this fantasy that people have a choice because capitalism is the ultimate manifestation of free choice in our society, in which they have to go live elsewhere. And all of these elsewhere places are the most geographically and climactically vulnerable places to disasters. So to answer your question, we are going to see exacerbated injustices as these communities locally are being sort of redrawn into other places that are much more vulnerable. And as we experience more active and more intense hurricane seasons, which are the most prevalent natural disasters that we face here in South Florida, we will undoubtedly see countless health disparities, income disparities, resource disparities that we're seeing now already, factoring in even more so death as part of the formula there. And all of this sounds very daunting, but I like to think that we have the diagnosis. We've had the diagnosis for so long. And now it's time to hold people accountable with the solutions, medicines, remedies to problems that we have recognized for a very long time now. And at Sunrise, we like to follow the proposal and principles and values of a Green New Deal, which we think is the only way, or at least its model is the only way that addresses the climate crisis and interwoven crises of our time at the scope at which they need to be addressed.
Definitely, that's a lot. I agree with a lot of what was said as well. I think these storms are going to get worse and worse and worse, and we're seeing that. I mean, just this hurricane season, if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, we see, storm after storm, and I just, just got a little bit afraid for Louisiana and states in the Gulf Coast. Just really scary stuff, and it's only going to continue to get worse. And we see this every single hurricane season. This whole, game of get prepared. Take your personal responsibility and get the stuff that you need so that you're not, left out in the dark when a hurricane hits. Don't wait until the last minute type of situation. But we never see the accountability on the side of fossil fuel companies or government officials for what they're doing to the environment, for fracking, for what they're doing, what they're trying to do with the Everglades now. With sugar companies, with the fossil fuel companies, with FPL utilities. We never see any accountability on any of those entities. There's always a personal responsibility situation of you should get ready for this storm. These storms just magically come every single year and there's no way to stop it. They're just going to come every single year. And we don't tell people this is a result of man-made contributions to climate change through our practices, our industrial practices. So we're only going to continue to see, like that. I'll pull yourself by your bootstraps. We're only going to continue to see all of these disparities be exacerbated in the next few years. I mean, I say the next 10 years are going to be really crucial for us to get a Green New Deal to really prevent the worst of the worst. I don't want to say I don't have faith in that happening. I like to be forward-looking and think that's going to happen, but I don't know. I really don't know. The way they draw political districts, whether those are House or Senate districts, they draw those in a specific way they gerrymander these in a specific way to keep power from people from gaining power in the legislature to pass things like the Green New Deal. And those districts are drawn the same way. They draw these economic districts as well. They're economic opportunity zones, they like to call it. So it's only going to get worse. If we look at the housing, we look at housing right now, and we see this with the pandemic, but we also see this every time a storm hits. You see people with insurance, they get a category 2 or 3 storm might hit, and they have property insurance. But I really think it will really have to take a really bad storm for these people to really give a crap. That's why they're moving away now from the shores, and they're gentrifying. I call it climate gentrification, but they're gentrifying a lot of other communities. They started in my neighborhood already, and they've been moving over slowly and kicking people out to build our condos on higher ground away from the coast. Because it's not that they don't believe in climate change, even though that's what a lot of them say. It's because they know, and they're in the stage of grief called denial, where they just won't come to terms with the fact that they destroyed the planet and that we got to get our act together. And it might be too late in many ways. So now we have a situation where they're moving in, they're kicking people out. We see this in Little Haiti, we see this in Sistrunk, we see this in Pompano, we see this in a lot of different communities where people are being displaced, real deal climate refugees in our own backyard, not some faraway fiction land, but right here in our own backyard, being pushed out and nowhere else to go because of climate change, because of people who see nothing else but commodities. They see housing as just a commodity, something they can gain profit off of, and not as a human right for everyday people. So we're going to see this in the housing system. We're going to see this in just about everything in our society. So we got to get ahead of it. I think the Green New Deal is a perfect way of going, and that's why I worked together with a few other people, and we co-authored something called the Florida Climate and Economic Defense Initiative. Technically a Green New Deal in Florida, we just got a fancy name, but it essentially tackles all of these things from the specific types of the future energies we could use, whether that is moving away from fossil fuel to solar, exploring nuclear, exploring all of these different options to move away from fossil fuel energy, looking at other things as well, how we transform our economic system as well, because as long as we have the economic system we currently have, we'll continue to run into roadblocks, because the goal of a capitalist economic system is to maximize your profits as much as possible. So in short, we got to get a Green New Deal. We got to get it fast, or we're in some real deal trouble. And we should probably start looking at the development we see happening in our communities and how we can slow that development down. It doesn't make any sense.
Wonderful points. And I especially love the explicit connection that you're making between sort of a capitalist approach, the development approach, for instance, in Little Haiti, and almost the responsibility or liability that comes from governance of that same area. And what I think is an indictment of the way we've operated collectively to this point is that largely the proactive work of addressing these inequities does not necessarily live with our institutions of government. It lives with nonprofits, it lives with individuals, it lives with community activists. So there is a disparity in the allocation of resources that we're willing to put toward being proactive about addressing a historic inequity that has contemporary consequences. JP mentioned redlining. You can't discuss the geography of Miami, the most sea level rise threatened city on the planet, without understanding the role that redlining and explicit legislative racism in our state's history has had in putting people where they are today, right? Little Haiti was not a desirable place to live, but you better believe that people quickly realized that the elevation for most of Little Haiti is twice as high as it is on the other side of Biscayne, right? And so all of a sudden we're seeing a reckoning that's coming with a contemporary example of gentrification happening in real time to an ethnic enclave, an important ethnic enclave in terms of the makeup of our city. And so I think that you've got to understand that this is not an isolated thing. This doesn't necessarily have to do with climate gentrification. And this takes us back to the sort of crux of the point of our conversation today, which is the intertwined relationship of racial justice and climate justice. And so I think in terms of what does this mean for impacts? Well, listen, in the Keys a couple years ago, the legislature there was like, you know what, this flooding is getting so bad, they proposed what's called a managed retreat, which is essentially buying people out of their depreciating property, the depreciating in value properties, and allowing the ocean to just take over that space. Now, where are those people going to go? Well, if they want to stay in Florida, a lot of them are going to go further inland. So now we're impacting markets, not just here in South Florida. Now we're impacting the housing market for people in Orlando. And guess what? In the Office of Climate Resilience in Orlando, they're already planning for climate refugees from their own state. So there is the opportunity to be forward thinking. There is the opportunity to leverage the institutions that are supposed to represent all of us, not just the wealthiest or whitest of us. But that has not historically been the case as it comes to addressing those issues here. So I would love to see, I would love to see more representation. I would love to see Elijah in the State House. I would love to see JP doing things in the city. Young people understand, and especially I think young people from Miami have sort of, you've grown up with this sense of impending doom, living in a place where climate change is ground zero, and you have so many of our other sort of societal inequities on full display. So I would say that representation is critical, is hugely important. It's everything. Representation, giving power to communities where these effects are being felt most dearly. So I'm inspired and encouraged by the number of young people who seem to be starting 2 or 3 steps ahead of where a lot of people from previous generations were along their understandings of inequity, along their understandings of the science behind climate change. That gives me hope for starting to address some of these things. But I think the short-term answer is we're going to see money grabs. Take, for example, the PPP loans that the government was giving out, the federal government was giving out during the pandemic. I mean, there's huge private schools with multi-million-dollar institutions and endowments who are getting $3 and $4 million, and then using that money to, buy the principal of the school a fancier house or something like that. So I think that until we are ready to address like all of it, it's going to be kind of difficult to just say, I want to work on this one piece. And it's why conversations, I think, are a critical part of starting to build that critical mass. This conversation needs to be normalized. As someone who is in his 30s, this was not the normal conversation when I was a kid. So I'm glad to see young leaders stepping up and really pushing this conversation as just a part of being a good citizen here in South Florida.
So everyone has already mentioned the displacement and exploitation of vulnerable communities, and JP made a great point in their being disposed, as oftentimes these displaced communities are relocated to undesirable locations that would otherwise remain uninhabited. So can you describe the relationship between climate change, the fossil fuel industry and corporate greed, and minority groups' quality of life? How does it relate to increased asthma rates and exposure to toxic pollutants specifically? And if we could also switch the order to start with Elijah, then go to Nick, and then lastly JP.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. I used to, up until a few months ago, I used to live across the street from what used to be a major trash dump in Broward County, just about 35 years ago, I believe. And now it was a school. They had to close the school, and now it's a park where kids play. I lived right across the street from it. And I met an individual who lived across the street from it as well. He was my neighbor, and he was an older gentleman. He had to be like in his 70s or 80s. He grew up in the neighborhood. He would tell me all the time how, like, I've been going to war with the city. I don't believe that this land is safe for the kids to be having a playground or a school there. And they say that it's safe and the radiation levels and the toxic levels are low and everything, but I don't believe it. And he's been fighting for, decades and decades, and no one else is fighting anymore. And he's just like, I mean, I'm trying to tell you guys, this isn't safe. The EPA came in, the state came in and said it was great. The state said it was great. And that just goes to show you, that's just one clear example of how Black people are forced to live, and low-income people are forced to live across the country. And right here in South Florida too. Trash dumps. What used to be trash dumps, which are now schools, which are now playgrounds for kids, parks for human beings to actually go there and play every day without even knowing or being informed that used to be a major trash dump site, where the city is saying it's now treated, but we don't believe it's actually treated. But it isn't just, sites like that. It's the quality of the water, the drinking water. It's the quality of the infrastructure as well, where the infrastructure is not built to be resilient. It's not built to handle storms. It's not built to handle hurricanes or major floods. In my own neighborhood, it will flood sometime, and when it floods, it's impossible to walk out of the house or to walk anywhere without getting soaking wet up to your knees. That much water, because the drainage system, the sewage and drainage systems are not built to earth. But in a lot of other communities, a lot of higher class communities, white areas, let's be honest. The infrastructure looks entirely different. They have better drainage systems. I mean, I know Fort Lauderdale is having a crisis right now, but better drainage systems by far in the Los Olas area, in the Victoria Park area near the beach. Better drainage systems to handle flooding. They have better quality of life. There's no trash dumps where, it used to be a trash dump and now a park. But really, just in short, I mean, we've been forced to be in that position because we have a system that devalues Black life. It devalues Black people. It devalues people of color. And we don't have any money to really fight. We don't have anywhere else to go. This is where we are. We've been here for generations. And now they're coming in and displacing us so that they can fix up the area. They say they want to make modest infrastructure improvements, but really what's happening is they're gentrifying the area. They're coming in, pushing us out because they know something we might not know. So, I mean, that's just one example. That's the environmental impact, but this all has an impact on people's health, where you have people who are having respiratory problems who live in the neighborhood. There's what used to be a trash dump there is probably still high levels of toxicity in the ground that hasn't been properly treated. People have high levels of lung cancer in the community, unbelievable amounts of asthma in the community, people getting sick, deformities in a lot of our communities, a lot of deformities, and people don't know where all of this is coming from. And it also is tied in economically as well with the amount of food deserts we have. Where now we have no major place to get fresh produce besides a Walmart. The only thing we have is a Walmart in our community we can go to. And we're just pretty much at the whim of a really large multinational corporation to get us to get food and drinks and everything we need. And it's just really sad. It's an indictment of the entire system. It's an indictment, and it's important to not just talk about it on a national or statewide level, but really local, how local governments play into all of this too. Everyone focuses on the large corporations or the national government or the state, but local governments are willing participants in all of this, very, very willing participants in all of this. They allow parks to be built on this land. They allow there to be food deserts. They specifically zone communities to look the way they do and to have what they have. So this is all, this all goes back to how we plan and zone things as well, and which is why planning and zoning is important, because that ties into how we're going to combat climate change as well. If we're going to zone everything on the beach to continue to build high rises and luxury hotels and condominiums, we're going to degrade the infrastructure in Black and brown communities to the point where no one really can actually live there with a higher quality of life. And we're going to, as a result of that, the property value is going to be low. No one wants to go there. There's not a real strong tax base there. So you can see how all of these things are literally just created by man. Like every single aspect of this is created by somebody. Somebody's just sitting there and they're creating this problem and they're not fixing the problem. And as a result, we have these major inequities in society as a result of man-made, not just climate change, man-made economic decisions that they made to kind of corner us off into a particular area and just kind of do, I'm gonna be honest, I call it a genocide. Just put all of these Black people in one, area, one part of the city, and let's degrade the entire city where no one can live really nice or higher quality, a big quality of life. Just degrade the area as much as we possibly could. Don't tend to the infrastructure, don't tend to the water problems, don't tend to the housing, don't tend to the schools. Just degrade it as much as possible. And it's not just affecting people of color, it's affecting a lot of poor white people too in a lot of our cities too, to a lesser extent, but it still is. Well, let's get all of these poor people into one area. We put the Black people on the northwest side, and on the southwest side, we'll put, the poor white people, and then we'll just degrade the areas as much as possible. And to me, it's just genocide all over again. That's just what it screams.
Yeah, the fossil fuel industry has been hurtful and is as directly implicated as any other institution or factor you could conceive of. I mean, before those famous internal memos from ExxonMobil in the late 80s, where they acknowledged that they knew what was happening when you burn fossil fuels. We've had a scientific suspicion, I'd have to go back to pinpoint the date, but we've known for decades this relationship between the certain prevalence of particular they're called greenhouse gases, and that the increase of this in our atmosphere is leading to these other changes. So it's not just the extraction that was hurtful on the part of the fossil fuel industry. It was also the infiltration of our political system, the disinformation campaign that went along with it, and the decades of denialism, which cost my generation which for my entire lifetime has been sort of the modus operandi of fossil fuel industries, is just to deflect and completely remove themselves from any liability or even knowledge of what was patently obvious to 97% of climate scientists. And so what does that look like? I want to send you this. I'm going to put it in, make sure I have the right one. I want to share with you all this really great chart. This is, I think, from a couple years ago, but if you want to see one of the impacts of the fossil fuel industry, these are a list of candidates who are sort of climate deniers. They're accepting money from fossil fuel, right? And it'll tell you even how much they've accepted. That goes directly to the other half of this conversation, the racial justice piece, because we know that we don't have adequate representation in our legislative bodies for the population that actually exists in America. And especially in Florida, we can trace back legislative history and understand the lengths that our state has gone, in particular to disenfranchise non-whites from holding power and making decisions on behalf of their communities. So I think it's a pretty clear relationship between, you can connect the dots pretty easily between what the fossil fuel industry knew, the actual extraction of the fossil fuels that harms the earth, and how that is leading to, for instance, the presence of, here's a quick interactive. If you're at home paying attention, what percentage of African Americans do you think live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant? What percentage of all African Americans in the US live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant? If anybody wants to wager a guess. And if not, I'll just tell you anyway. Okay, well, surprise, 68% of all African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. You talk about the particulate matter that comes from that, the effect on asthma. Asthma causes roughly 14 million days of truancy from school, absence from school, 14 million per year. And if you want to break down who has asthma, the rate of asthma goes up as your socioeconomic level goes down, and the rate of asthma goes up as you move away from non-white populations. Now, you can overlay those two ideas and get a pretty clear picture of one of the real impacts of the fossil fuels extraction, their denial, their disinformation, their lobbying, and how that has led to degraded conditions for lots of people, and in particular for people of color, for poor people, and for women and children. So it's, I think it's game, set, match. And as we saw, just want to say, obviously 350 has been a huge part of divestment campaigns all across the world. And so it was a huge victory to see Exxon removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average, because it's doing such a crap job, which is not great for probably our grandparents' stock portfolios, but for us, it's welcome news.
I appreciate the wealth of information that has just been shared, and it really does speak to sort of the rampant detriment, not even just on the local level, but the international level, in terms of how the fossil fuel industry has completely weaponized profit to destroy Black and brown lives. I mean, throughout these past few weeks, months, years, we have seen the countless racist police murders and community genocides of Black communities. Who is funding those police departments? The fossil fuel industry has a big involvement in that. We see rampant imperialist American policies killing Black and brown mothers, men, and children in the Middle East in search for oil profits. Who's being thought of in those decisions? The fossil fuel industry. We have very entrenched corporate systems right now that are honestly very intersectional in their approach, if anything, in which we have this conglomerate that has very much been led by the fossil fuel industry on all fronts to devalue all sorts of lives. And that undoubtedly has led to the detriment of health in lots of communities, very much centered around anti-Blackness and a distaste and sort of idea of minority communities being disposable. People of color in general have about 35% of a higher chance of living near emission polluting facilities. When you when you poll that for Black communities alone, it's somewhere near 50% or higher. And we have pipelines going through supposedly sovereign tribal lands. And we have this complete devaluing of lives, cultures, communities, where we are ready to shed blood for the profits of a few people destroying our planet. And it really is an interconnected issue, and I don't want to take too much space on this question because I feel like the two prior panelists answered it so well in ways that I would have wanted to, but it's just, yeah, like it is very rampant. And in addressing the intersectionality of this issue, we also have to analyze the amount of power that we're up against right now and realize that the only thing that beats out intensity and money is the power of people on the re-education front who are ready to step up, re-educate a community to grab power and perform acts of massive non-cooperation. And this is something that should anger us a lot because it's literally a question of life and death. And we have to appreciate, that we're here surrounded by this coalition of people that have very different involvements, whether it be Nick working for an organization that serves to educate people on all of these issues, Elijah taking a movement up to halls of power, even though it didn't happen this time, I'm sure it will happen the next time, just has to happen. And then just people on the ground who are doing the work to create this sort of stuff. And some of the things that we have to keep in mind when it comes to movement building and moral escalation and polarization around which side are you on is that this is a hard fight just because of the powers that we're up against, but it is a necessary fight because if we don't win this battle, there's none left to fight. And it is very much needed that in fighting for these communities, you don't sort of take on the narrative of a white savior per se, but extend the leadership opportunities from your knowledge onto the communities that are being affected the most, just out of a necessity rather than moral righteousness. And let us create that multiracial working class movement that we need to achieve when it comes to confronting these problems.
We'll open things up now. If anyone has the call has any questions they'd like to ask, please do so.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we could hear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. So my name is Aaliyah. And first I would like to thank you guys for speaking to us and for all of the amazing work that you guys are doing in the community. I'd like to start by asking, what can we do as students? So I feel like we kind of had a very heavy conversation about all the power that we're up against, and I'm sort of left feeling hopeless. So what are some steps that we can take as students in our communities?
I'll definitely go ahead and answer that. That's a good question. I mean, I'm not gonna lie and say I haven't felt hopeless too. I kind of took a beating there with my race last week, unexpected loss. Um, and I'm young too. I'm still young. I know I'm starting to age a little bit, but I'm still young. But I guess I'll say, like, to continue doing what we're doing, even if we don't think it has an impact, or even if we don't think it has, some type of meaning to people, it does. People see what we're doing, whether that's organizing protests or strikes or youth climate strikes or conventions, or a lot of what we've seen this past year, especially the protests. They do get out. They do work, and a lot of people have seen this. I mean, for young people to continue doing what we're doing, I mean, especially if we're at the colleges and universities, to continue building that movement there, that's so critical and so important, because there is a major propaganda and disinformation campaign aimed at America's young people, mostly funded by the Koch brothers and other interests, including right-wing interests that are kind of tied in with the fossil fuel industry, to kind of, I don't want to say dumb down, but kind of propagandize our young people into not thinking about these issues. So we got to continue being a major presence, especially on colleges and universities. But I guess I'll say this too. I mean, I know it's not for everybody, but run for office too. I mean, it helps. I mean, we got to really challenge these people's power. Sometimes these people are up in their ivory towers and they don't see our protests. They don't turn on the news. They don't care. They don't think about any of these things. But then they're forced to think about it when they get, a challenger. So I encourage all young people to really get out there, run for something. It doesn't have to be a state house or mayor or anything. It can be something as simple as a city council seat, or as simple as taking a party seat. Politics is not going to be the answer to all our problems. Electoral politics isn't going to solve everything. But it does help to have allies in the halls of power who will be listening to us and thinking about what we're going to say. So run, but especially, my final piece of advice there is just keep building that power at the colleges and the universities, because there is a really major disinformation campaign aimed specifically at our generation, because they know our generation, Gen Z, is very, very forward-thinking and progressive. So they're trying to stop us ahead of time and kind of take that away. So that would be my advice on that.
This is Caroline Lewis. Can I ask these wonderful panelists? I'm so proud of you and your research and how articulate you all are. More than anything, I appreciate the call to run for office. I would love to support all of you in any effort you want. JP, you know how I feel about that. And I'd also like to ask you very seriously, what are you doing? What are we collectively doing to truly turn out the vote? The voter turnout for young people has been abysmal. The apathy or the feeling that somebody else will take care of it cannot prevail. So can you reassure me that all hands are on deck, and that our role between now and November 3rd is to get every single person we know, meet or greet to vote?
I'll answer this one too. I know I don't want to take up too much space. I mean, the question around that specifically, I say this as a person got my butt kicked because only 8% of young people in my district decided to vote. I don't shame them, because I find that as a failing on my part as a candidate to inspire more than 8% of the young people to really turn out. I don't have a simple answer for that. I mean, I'm sure one of the other panelists will probably have a better answer on this question specifically, but I'll just say we got to really honestly, a lot of the young people don't really feel inspired by what we have now, whether that's what we have in the White House or who we have on the presidential ticket. They just feel like, there's a lot of promises being made, and they feel like, especially during this time, this is a really dangerous election. We want to get this guy out. A lot of people are just not feeling it. A lot of young people, but really, we need people to really go and ask for their vote. That's the thing I find the most important, is we have to go and we have to get those young people out to vote. We can't expect them to. We have to go work for it, and we have to get them. Honestly, we got to get them something to vote for. I mean, from what I know of my own peers, it takes a lot to get a young person to want to get up on a Tuesday morning and get out of their bed and go drag themselves to the polling site and wait in line and go vote. and maybe for somebody they don't really even feel passionate about at all. So to get young people out to vote, it's going to take more than asking them to, or simply hoping they go out and vote. It's going to really take trying to give them something to vote for. So I think, as a candidate who lost, I'll say I find it a felony on myself to not have inspired more than 8% of people to vote. But I will say that I think it's important that the candidates running for office right now, whether that's Joe Biden or other down ballot candidates, really give young people something to vote for other than I'm not Trump. They really got to court the young people's vote, and they have to give something. And especially when we're talking about environment and climate change, the Green New Deal goes a long way. It's really popular. It's really popular with young people. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm going to have to say Joe Biden has to do a better job at reaching young people.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Caroline. And I see in your name that you're associated with Clio, so maybe you already know this, but again, ACE was a convening partner to do just what you're saying, which is to turn out as many young first-time climate voters as possible. And not just that, but do it in key states, battleground states. So my position as youth organizer is in Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So if you have a mind for the electoral map, you'll understand how significant those presence and those efforts will be. So check out, for those of you on the call, please do check out weareenough2020.org. It's all about using your voice and your power and your sphere of influence as a young person to get in touch with people who can be amenable to the idea of voting on a climate issue, on voting, as Elijah said, maybe having like the Green New Deal be something that inspires them. But I will say it has not been my experience thus far in talking to young people in 2020 that they are disconnected. There might be barriers for them, but there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of belief that this is a critical moment. And so I have faith that young people are going to rise to the challenge. As since 2016, the youngest voting bloc, made up of Gen Z and millennials, is now the largest voting bloc in the entire country. We have the political power if we want to exercise it. And I think that along with the rise of progressives and people who are championing science-based climate policy, from whichever side of the aisle you're on, the more we can see that sort of representation in our legislative bodies, I think it's just going to give even more fire to young people like Elijah and JP to step into leadership roles and actually pass some laws that are going to do us some good.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And, I agree with both sides. I think that, number one, it is unfortunate that young people aren't turning out in the numbers that we should be, but at the same time, we don't see ourselves being represented in the first place, which is kind of like a double-edged sword, because it's like, yeah, you can't see yourself represented when you're not, I guess, voted and forming part of the constituency, but nonetheless, you are part of the constituency. And regardless of whether you vote or not, the decisions of reps and people in power affect your day-to-day lives. So I'll tell you at least what we have in the books right now. We at Sunrise, and actually, you know what? I'm going to plug in a bit of the last question that Aaliyah asked. And one of the things that's super important is that we make sure that our concept of justice and accountability goes beyond the ballot box, that we don't stop there. One of the things that I was told by a friend of mine that I always think about is, if 5 people in a t-shirt show up at a commission meeting, they will pay attention. If 10 people in t-shirts show up at a commission meeting, they're going to shit themselves. And the power of organizing really is that. It is collected in unity towards a cause, and that can be brought to the ballot box. So at Sunrise Miami, we are an awfully new organization that literally started only a couple months ago. We've proudly racked up a good amount of power in the short time that we've been around. And one of the campaigns that we have going on right now that is very intertwined with both civil disobedience and the electoral endorsements that we are making is also, it's also in line with something else in which we've partnered with our policy director who goes to to essentially lead a workshop in which 700 leaders are going to be educated on how to use a platform that we've developed called Empower to have those 700 people who are trained then further train more people. So we have a starting amount of 700 people voting in the general election, and further are going to use those 700 leaders to get the vote out. And all of these people are 35 and younger. Well, actually even younger because they all go to college. But that's at least what we're doing, just to give you a little bit of hope there in terms of what I personally am looking to do.
Okay, so I really appreciate the thoughtful responses. I have to tell you, having worked with young people all my life and really feeling like I've inspired many, many, many of them, and they have inspired me right back. We need a more cogent rallying call for the November 3rd vote. I think the Enough campaign is splendid. I really love it because enough is exactly how we feel. But the point is, to have power, you need the numbers. And we have the numbers. The number of the voting bloc you just described of young people is the turning point. So somehow we have to communicate. We have the numbers to have the power for a more just world. Because what we're living now and what we're electing is not looking out for racial injustice and climate justice and all the things you know are preying on quality of life issues. So I would urge you to come up with a platform that 350, ACE, Clio, Green New Deal, everybody could use about rallying that youth vote. Power and numbers resonate with them. They want to feel that they are important and needed. And we have to play to that mental block in their heads that they're not important and they're not needed. But they are because of the numbers and the power those numbers give us.
I agree with that. I was also going to plug another group I know. There's a lot of groups doing a lot of good work around this. Plus One Vote is a group out there doing some specifically for getting like young people out to vote. They're doing a lot of stuff around social media. Engage Miami is one. But I know Plus One Vote is doing a lot of social media work, whether that's running ads or trying to get people to, get their friends to tag along to go vote as well. But a more splendid campaign will probably help out all of these groups. Something that really like shows young people how easy it is. Like one of the things we did to like mobilize a lot of young people in my race was, hey, look, voting is, it takes just as long as it takes to, get a coffee or get a, iced coffee or something. You really just go in, there's no line, especially during a pandemic. You go and you vote, or you can do it by mail. That just really has to be something that gets them, because a lot of young people, some are not inspired, some are inspired, they just don't think voting is the answer. And then you have a lot of young people who just, they put it in the back of their head and it's just not the most pressing thing like happening right now, especially during the pandemic. So it's just reminding them to do that. And like, that's been very helpful, especially for like how do you get to a generation that just really doesn't want you to like contact them that way or really get to them. So I find one of the things I found really, really successful with young people, like getting like young voters engaged in a process is like getting them to really see themselves in the process. Because usually when you have like, someone that's older, it's like, what is voting, blah, blah, blah. But when they see other young people like making it cool and like, hey, we're going to vote, we're going to, deal with the fossil fuel industry and what they're doing to our planet. Just having, again, like you said, a more rallying call is really helpful to get a lot of them turned out, because really like this year, it could make the difference, even if it's a little bit. So yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say on that.
Thank you.
It's unfortunately time to wrap things up. Thank you very much, Elijah, JP, and Nick, for taking the time to speak to us. Thanks to all those in attendance on the call. Let's keep these discussions going, whether it be the large groups or just, as intimate as just family and friends, because at the end of the day, this type of work, these conversations really do make a difference. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great weekend and stay safe.
Thank you so much for having us on. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care, everybody.
Thank you again.
Thank you.